Ever heard of a school making rules about hairstyles? Seems pretty normal, right?
Sure, you see it all the time.
But what happens when those rules end up in court? We're going to dive deep into a situation at GC Foster College in Jamaica, where some male students were barred from entering because of their long hair and cornrows.
Interesting.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, interesting school rule, but how does this involve data protection? And honestly, that was my first thought too.
Yeah, it's not an obvious connection. A lot of people might not realize that in Jamaica, they have the Data Protection Act. We call it the DPA, and it's basically there to protect your personal information.
Makes sense.
It ensures that sensitive data about you is handled responsibly and legally. So it's a pretty big deal.
So we've got this law about personal data and a school setting rules about hairstyles. The article that we're diving into today connects those two things, and it's by a legal expert who also happens to be a radio host, so talk about a fascinating combo.
For sure. And that's always a plus, right?
Yeah.
Someone who knows how to explain these things clearly.
Exactly. Their big question, could a person's hairstyle actually fall under the Jamaican DPA as personal data?
That's a really good question. I mean, to figure that out, we have to look at how the DPA defines biometric data.
Yep.
So think fingerprints, iris scans, things that are biologically unique to you, they can be used to identify you.
Right, right.
And the DPA wants to protect that kind of sensitive information.
Okay, so we're talking about stuff that's literally part of your DNA, but hairstyles, those are choices they can change. How could that be biometric in the same way?
You're totally right. And the article points out that very distinction.
Okay.
Hairstyles, while part of your appearance, aren't seen as a unique identifier like a fingerprint. They're not permanent. You can change your hairstyle, style it differently,
Hold on, I'm confused. I thought this whole deep dive was about whether this hairstyle rule falls under the DPA. Are we saying it doesn't apply at all? What a twist.
Well, you got to give the author credit for keeping us on our toes.
All right.
While the DPA might not directly apply in this case, they argue that doesn't mean the students are out of options.
Oh.
And that's where things get really interesting because it touches on some bigger issues of potential discrimination and human rights.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more. What are these other options? I love how a deep dive can lead to unexpected places.
I know, right? What's fascinating is how the article shifts gears here. It starts talking about the bigger picture. Even if hairstyles don't neatly fit into the DPA's biometric data box, that doesn't mean schools have a free pass to make any rules they want about appearances.
That makes sense. So where do we go from here?
Well, the article points to a landmark case in Jamaica, what's known as the Virgo case.
Okay.
Imagine being told you can't go to school because of your dreadlocks.
Wow.
That's exactly what happened to a student there. And the case ended up going all the way to Jamaica's highest court. Talk about a big deal.
Okay, so what happened? Did the court side with the student who wanted to keep his dreadlocks? Or with the school? This must be an important precedent for what's happening at GC Foster now.
It's a bit of both, actually.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
So the court ruled against the student in that specific case.
They did.
But they also said that schools can't just create any rule about appearance.
It's really interesting, right? Because you would think that the school would just get to make the rules, but
Right.
there has to be that balance. They have to think about a student's right to freedom of expression and cultural identity, especially when dealing with something as personal as hair.
Totally.
So that one case set a major precedent in Jamaica.
Yeah, so even though that particular student didn't win, his case really opened the door for future challenges, right? Showing that it's not always so black and white.
Exactly. It's not simply, do they have a rule, yes or no?
Yeah.
It's about whether that rule was fairly made and whether it, steps on someone's fundamental rights.
Right.
And that's what makes things potentially tricky for GC Foster.
Totally. Okay. All right, you've officially piqued my interest. How could this Virgo case directly help the students at GC Foster who are being told they can't have long hair or cornrows?
Well, that's the heart of the issue.
Right.
The article argues that these students might have a case for discrimination.
Okay.
Basically, that means a rule might seem neutral on the surface,
Okay.
but in practice, it ends up disadvantaging certain groups more than others.
Okay, so it's like you can't just call a zebra a horse and pretend it's not being treated differently because of its stripes. I get the analogy, but how would these students actually prove that the hairstyle rule is indirectly discriminatory? That seems tricky.
Yeah, you're right. It's not always straightforward.
Right.
They would need to show a pattern of how the rule is enforced and who it really impacts.
Okay.
Like, Are there significantly more students from specific backgrounds being disciplined under this rule compared to others? That kind of evidence could build compelling case.
Okay, so that's indirect discrimination. What about that other avenue the article mentioned? Something about basic human rights being violated. That sounds pretty serious.
It is, and this is where the Jamaican Constitution comes in.
Okay.
It guarantees certain fundamental rights and freedoms to all citizens.
Okay.
Things like freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the big ones.
Right, the core values a society is built on.
Exactly. And what's interesting here is that the author argues that if a student's chosen hairstyle is a genuine expression of their cultural identity or tied to how they practice their religion.
Then forcing them to change it could be seen as infringing on those fundamental rights.
Right. It's like saying, we respect your right to believe what you believe, but not to express it outwardly in this specific way.
That does seem like a bit of a gray area.
It is.
How would a court even begin to decide where the line is?
It's definitely tricky. The courts would need to weigh the school's right to set some standards, like dress codes and appearance guidelines, against an individual's right to freedom of expression and religious practice.
Right?
It's about finding that balance, and that's never easy.
No easy answers here. But this conversation is already making me think differently.
Yeah.
It's not just about hairstyles. It's about these much bigger questions of individual freedom, cultural sensitivity, and how we balance potentially conflicting rights in a diverse society. I mean, this case is specifically about a school in Jamaica, but these issues feel so universal, don't they?
Absolutely. This tension between personal expression and institutional rules, it's something that plays out everywhere.
Right, right.
We see it in debates about dress codes, religious symbols, even things like tattoos and piercings.
Totally.
The constant negotiation.
So true. And it's not just about schools either, right? Think
Yeah.
about workplaces, religious institutions, even just navigating social norms in our everyday lives.
Everywhere.
This case might be happening in Jamaica, but it feels incredibly relevant to anyone who's ever felt like they had to conform to a certain standard of appearance.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It speaks to that universal desire to be accepted for who you are without having to sacrifice parts of your identity.
Right, without having to sacrifice who you are.
Yeah.
It's really making me think about those unspoken rules and expectations we often just accept without questioning them.
That's the power of a deep dive, isn't it?
Totally.
It takes a seemingly specific situation and uses it to illuminate these broader, often unexamined aspects of how we live and interact with each other.
For sure, for sure. Okay, what would a good outcome for the students at GC Foster even look like at this point? What are some concrete things they could hope to achieve?
Well, ideally, they'd want the school to reconsider this hairstyle policy.
Right, to just say, you know what, this is causing more trouble than it's worth. Let's scrap it.
Yeah, let's just get rid of it. It's not always that simple.
Uh-huh.
Schools do have a legitimate interest in setting some standards of appearance.
Of course, of course.
It's about finding that sweet spot, a policy that feels both reasonable and respectful of everyone's rights.
Right. Finding that line.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as saying all hairstyle rules are inherently bad or discriminatory.
Exactly. It's about finding that middle ground, and that's where things get really interesting on a practical level.
Right.
How do you create a hairstyle policy that respects individual expression while still maintaining a certain standard of neatness or whatever the school's goals are?
Right. What are some key things they should keep in mind when creating a new hairstyle policy?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
So they're really looking for what that purpose is and making sure it's a strong one.
Yeah, and it can't just be about, like, this is how we've always done it, or this is what we think looks professional.
Yeah, right.
It has to be tied to something more concrete, something that makes sense in the context of education.
It's about those kids and making sure that they're able to, be themselves and learn in an environment that's conducive to that.
And that brings us back to those win-win solutions we were talking about. It's about shifting the focus to those underlying principles, those things that actually matter for a healthy and productive learning environment.
This whole conversation has been so insightful.
It has been fascinating, hasn't it?
Yeah, I started out thinking it was just going to be about this one case in Jamaica, but it's really sparked a much broader discussion.
It always seems to happen that way with these deep dives.
It really does. So to our listener, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's this. The next time you come across a rule, whether it's at school, at work, anywhere, and it just doesn't sit right with you, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yes. Question everything.
Is there a good reason for this rule? Is it actually necessary? Could we achieve the same goal in a way that's more fair and inclusive?
Those are great questions to ask.
Because you never know, you might just spark a really important conversation.
You might be the catalyst for positive change.
Exactly. And that's what it's all about, right? Creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation, and I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.